I have to admit, the question, how did so many lobbyists infiltrate COP28, this global meeting of world leaders to discuss climate change, it's a bit of a trick question. Because the real question is, how did we not notice sooner?
Apparently, we have more than 600 fossil fuel lobbyists at this COP.
Among the thousands of delegates are more than 600 representatives from oil and gas.
Look at this. Members of the fossil fuel industry who've attended COP climate talks over the last 20 years. Royal Dutch Shell tops the list. Eni is an Italian multinational oil company, Petrobras, based in Brazil. Together, they've sent hundreds of delegates to COP. That's according to an audit by a global advocacy coalition called Kick Big Polluters Out. But they say dramatically outnumbering staff from fossil fuel companies were people from the trade associations that represented them. 6,581 since COP9 in 2003. And they figure all these numbers are conservative estimates, by the way, because it was only this year that the UN made it a requirement that fossil fuel lobbyists identify themselves as such when registering. So until now, you often had to dig into individual CVs to figure out who really works for whom. But their impact over the years has been undeniable. Let's start by being clear. Lobbyists have been coming to COP events for a long time, and there are thousands of people who attend each year as observers. NGOs, professional groups, they're allowed to attend, listen, learn, share ideas. That's how most lobbyists get in the door. But industry players can also get accreditation by joining a national delegation. That's what happened last year, for example, at COP27 in Egypt. According to the Associated Press, 2 employees with the China National Petroleum Company were accredited with Niger's delegation. How'd they manage that? They were building a pipeline in that country at the time.
Like, there's any number of ways in which someone can get a badge representing some other entity, especially if you're not an employee of the fossil fuel company itself, but let's say you're a consultant or a hired lobbyist. Like, you can pivot to getting a badge from someone else who doesn't have as offensive credentials and kind of slip through the process that way.
At last year's COP27, estimates varied, but maybe there were between 400 and 600 people linked in some way to the fossil fuel industry. That was a record, by the way. This year, almost everyone agrees COP28 in the United Arab Emirates will surpass that, and they'll be busy.
The way these conferences operate is they're sort of divided into zones. You've got a blue zone, which is where the formal negotiators and their advisors meet. But then you've got a much larger green zone.
The green zone, you can think of as almost like a kind of trade show. Different organizations, different interests paying for a platform. The larger the company, the easier it is to afford. Those that have pavilions might be able to invite certain governments to come and have a conversation, the head of a Swiss climate change NGO told NPR. Now, influence can be exerted in many ways. Sometimes it's a conversation on the trade show floor. Sometimes it's away from the spotlight.
Whether or not it's in the green zone or, restaurants in Dubai, that is a part of this global event as well.
Or sometimes that influence finds its way directly into the official agreements themselves, penned and agreed upon by world leaders. The Paris Agreement that came out of COP21 was a major milestone for the world. All of this talk today about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that was Paris. And if you've ever read the agreement, there is an interesting story behind Article 6. So it sets out a framework for what are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, which sounds really complicated until you realize they're just a form of carbon credit.
You've probably heard the terms carbon credits or carbon offsets. But what exactly do they mean?
Carbon credits are just a system where industries or countries that fall short of meeting emissions reduction targets can effectively buy their way out of a shortfall. So in the context of the Paris Agreement, maybe that looks like country A financing a project in country B that allows them to reduce their emissions. But country A takes credit for that in their own accounting as a way of hitting their target more cheaply. This extra leeway for the most polluting countries is something that industry had demanded for a long time. And according to The Intercept, Shell's chief climate advisor himself says he played a part in that framework making the final cut in the Paris Agreement. We can take some credit for the fact that Article 6 is even there at all, he told a conference years later. We have had a process running for 4 years for the need of carbon unit trading to be part of the Paris Agreement. We put together a straw proposal. Many of the elements of that straw proposal appear in the Paris Agreement.
Ultimately, the final text that's agreed upon is the work of governments. But these governments are also taking into account the interests of their national companies, the operations in their countries. So I think it's indirect.
A U.S. Democratic senator and a member of European Parliament issued a joint statement this week. We continue to have profound concern that current rules permit private sector polluters to exert undue influence. And in a post from the head of a Swiss climate change NGO, the one that we heard from earlier, I fear that COPs are becoming little more than a circus, with the petrostates as the ringmasters and us the clowns. For the sake of humanity, we must ask whether we have all become clowns in the climate circus.
But what's different this time is literally the head of the largest oil and gas company in the United Arab Emirates is leading the negotiations.
Yes, what makes this COP different from all the others is the complicated background of its president, Sultan Al Jaber.
This is your opportunity to show the world that, in fact, you are central to the solution.
He is supported internationally, the UN's pick to lead the conference, and he has green credentials as the co-founder of Masdar, a leader in renewable energy. But he's also the CEO of ADNOC, the United Arab Emirates national oil company.
And the fifth largest oil producer, it's basically a petrostate. So one, you have the optics of hosting this climate conference that is supposed to be weaning the world off of oil and gas in a place that is very much dependent on selling oil and gas.
As president, it's Al Jaber's job to lead and facilitate negotiations. He helps set the agenda, appointing others who keep it on track while presiding over those key moments where actual decisions are made. So the questions his critics ask is, as the head of both a renewable energy company and an oil company, which way does he lean? Can he really straddle that blurry boundary between seeking climate change and sticking with the climate status quo? The Guardian reported this year how COP28 Summit Office shared an email server with ADNOC, meaning the Emirates National Oil Company could read COP28 emails. And the BBC reported this week how leaked documents showed Al Jaber's plan to discuss corporate fossil fuel plans with 15 nations during the COP28 summit. In both cases, COP28 representatives dispute the reporting and dispute any harm was done. And regarding any private conversations Al Jaber may have with other national delegations, they said this to the BBC. Dr. Sultan Al Jaber holds a number of positions alongside his role as COP28 president designate. That is public knowledge. Private meetings are private, and we do not comment on them.
The revelations from the BBC are substantial. So I think that certainly has cast a cloud over these negotiations, one that he's very much trying to dispel. This COP in the UAE is going to be an important test of the hypothesis that oil and gas companies need to be part of the energy transition.
In their defense, lobbyists say they actually have a very rightful place at the table. How else, they say, could you develop solutions to climate change than by involving those companies who need to change? But it also goes without saying, there is a line somewhere between supporting solutions and standing in the way of them.